and welcome back. Tonight I will continue to read The Book of Lost Things by John Connoly from Chapter 2. Chapter 2 of Rose and Dr. Moberly and the Importance of Details. It was a strange thing, but shortly after his mother died, David remembered experiencing a sense almost of relief. There was no other word for it, and it made David feel bad about himself. His mother was gone, and she was never coming back. It didn't matter what the priest said in his sermon, that David's mother was now in a better, happier place, and her pain was at an end. It didn't help when he told David that his mother would always be with him, even if he couldn't see her. An unseen mother couldn't go for long walks with you on summer evenings, drawing the names of trees and flowers from her seemingly infinite knowledge of nature, or help you with your homework, the familiar scent of her in your nostrils as she leaned in to correct a misspelling or puzzle over the meaning of an unfamiliar poem, or read with you on cold Sunday afternoons when the fire was burning and the rain was beating down upon the windows and the roof and the room was filled with the smell of wood smoke and crumpets. But then David recalled that, in those final months David's father would not return from work at the university until 6 at the earliest, and sometimes even later than that. This meant that David was stuck in the empty house with only the wireless and his books for company. Sometimes he would sit in the bedroom that his father and mother had once shared. Her clothes were still in one of the wardrobes, the dresses and skirts lined up in such neat rows that they almost looked like people themselves if you squinted hard enough. David would run his fingers along them and make them swish, remembering he did so that they had moved in just that way when his mother walked in them. Then he would lie back on the pillow to the left, for that was the side on which his mother used to sleep, and try to rest his head against the same spot on which she had once rested her head, the place obvious from the slightly dark stain upon the pillowcase. This new world was too painful to cope with. He had tried so hard, he had kept to his routines, he had counted so carefully, he had abided by the rules, but life had cheated. This world was not like the world of his stories. In that world, good was rewarded and evil was punished. If you kept to the path and stayed out of the forest, then you would be safe. If someone was sick, like the old king in one of the tales, then his sons would be sent out into the world to seek the remedy, the water of life, and if just one of them was brave enough and true enough, then the king's life could be saved. David had been brave. His mother had been braver still. In the end, bravery had not been enough. This was a world that did not reward it. The more David thought about it, the more he did not want to be a part of such a world. He still kept to his routines, although not quite as rigidly as he once did. He was content merely to touch the doorknobs and tap twice, left hand first, then right, just to keep the numbers even. He still tried to put his left foot down first on the floor in the mornings or on the stairs of the house, but that wasn't so difficult. He wasn't sure what would happen now if he didn't adhere to his rules to some degree. He supposed that it might affect his father. Perhaps in sticking to his routines he had saved his father's life, even if he hadn't quite managed to save his mother. Now that it was just the two of them, it was important not to take too many chances, and that was when Rose entered his life and the attacks began. The first time it was in Trafalgar Square, when he and his father were walking down to feed the pigeons after Sunday lunch at the Popular Cafe in Piccadilly. His father said that the Popular was due to close soon, which made David sad, as he thought it was very grand. David's mother had been dead for 5 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. A woman had joined them to eat at the Popular that day. His father had introduced her to David as Rose. Rose was very thin, with long dark hair and bright red lips. Her clothes looked expensive, and gold and diamonds glittered at her ears and throat. She claimed to eat very little, although she finished most of her chicken that afternoon and had plenty of room for pudding afterward. She looked familiar to David, and it emerged that she was the administrator of the not-quite hospital in which his mother had died. His father told David that Rose had looked after his mother really, really well, although not, David thought, well enough to keep her from dying. Rose tried to speak with David about school and his friends and what he liked to do with his evenings, but David could barely manage to respond. He didn't like the way that she looked at his father or the way that she called him by his first name. He didn't like the way that she touched his hand when he said something funny or clever. He didn't like the fact that his father was trying to be funny and clever with her to begin with. It wasn't right. Rose held on to his father's arm as they strolled from the restaurant. David walked a little ahead of them, and they seemed content to let him go. He wasn't sure what was happening, or that was what he told himself. Instead, he silently accepted a bag of seeds from his father when they reached Trafalgar Square, and he used them to draw the pigeons to him. The pigeons bobbed obediently toward his new source of food, their feathers stained with the muck and soot of the city, their eyes vacant and stupid. His father and Rose stood nearby, talking quietly to each other. When they thought he wasn't looking, David saw them kiss briefly. The was when it happened. One moment, David's arm was outstretched, a thin line of seeds spread along it, and two rather heavy pigeons picking away at his sleeve, and the next he was lying flat on the ground, his father's coat beneath his head, and curious onlookers, and the odd pigeon staring down at him, fat clouds scudding behind their heads like blank thought balloons. His father told him that he had fainted, and David supposed that he must have been right, except there were now voices and whispers in his head, where no voices and whispers had been before, and he had a fading memory of a wooded landscape and the howling of wolves. He heard Rose ask if she could do anything to help, and David's father told her that it was all right, that he would take him home and put him to bed. His father hailed a cab to bring them back to their car. Before he left, he told Rose he would telephone her later. That night, as David lay in his room, the whispers in his head were joined by the sound of the books. He had to put his pillow over his ears to drown out the noise of their chatter, as the oldest of the stories roused themselves from their night slumbers and began to look for places in which to grow. Dr. Moberly's office was in a terraced house on a tree-lined street in the center of London, and it was very quiet. There were expensive carpets on the floors, and the walls were decorated with pictures of ships at sea. An elderly secretary with very white hair sat behind a desk in the waiting room, shuffling papers, typing letters, and taking telephone calls. David sat on a big sofa nearby, his father beside him. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner. David and his father didn't speak. Mostly it was because the room was so quiet that anything they said would have been overheard by the lady behind the desk. But David also felt that his father was angry with him. There had been 2 more attacks since the Trafalgar Square, each one longer than the last, and each leaving David with more strange images in his mind. A castle with banners fluttering from the walls, a forest filled with trees that bled redly from their bark, and a half-glimpsed figure, hunched and wretched, who moved through the shadows of this strange world, waiting. David's father had taken him to see their family doctor, Dr. Benson, but Dr. Benson had been unable to find anything wrong with David. He sent David to a specialist at a big hospital who shone lights in David's eyes and examined his skull. He asked David some questions, then asked David's father many more, some of them concerning David's mother and her death. David had then been told to wait outside while they talked, and when David's father came out, he looked angry. That was how they had ended up at Dr. Moberly's office. Dr. Moberly was a psychiatrist. A buzzer sounded beside the secretary's desk, and she nodded to David and his father. "He can go in now," she said. "Off you go," said David's father. "Aren't you coming in with me?" asked David. David's father shook his head, and David knew that he had already spoken with Dr. Moberly, perhaps over the telephone. "He wants to see you alone. Don't worry, I'll be here when you're finished." David followed the secretary into another room. It was much bigger and grander than the waiting room, furnished with soft chairs and couches. The walls were lined with books, although they were not books like the ones David reads. David thought that he could hear the books talking among themselves. When he arrived, he couldn't understand most of what they were saying, but they spoke very slowly, as if what they had to impart was very important, or the person to whom they were speaking was very stupid. Some of the books appeared to be arguing among themselves in blah 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 tones, the way experts sometimes talked on the wireless when they were addressing one another, surrounded by other experts whom they were trying to impress with their intelligence. The books made David very uneasy. A small man with gray hair and a gray beard sat behind an antique desk that looked too big for him. He wore rectangular glasses with a gold chain to keep him from losing them. A red and black bow tie was knotted tightly at his neck, and his suit was dark and baggy. "Welcome," he said. "I'm Dr. Moberly. You must be David." David didn't seem terribly clever. Very slowly, David explained that without slates on the roof, the rain would get in, and in their way, they were just as important as walls. Dr. Mobley asked David if he was afraid of the rain getting in. David told him that he didn't like getting wet. It wasn't so bad outside, especially if you were dressed for it, but most people didn't dress for rain indoors. Dr. Mobley looked a bit confused. Next, he asked David to draw a tree. Again, David took the pencil, painstakingly drew the branches, then proceeded to add little leaves to each one. He was on only the third branch when Dr. Mobley asked him to stop again. This time, Dr. Mobley had the kind of expression on his face that David's father sometimes had when he managed to finish the crossword in the Sunday paper. Short of standing up and shouting "aha" with his finger pointing in the air, the way mad scientists did in cartoons, he couldn't have looked more pleased with himself. Dr. Mobley then asked David a lot of questions about his home, his mom, and his dad. He asked again about the blackouts and if David could remember anything about them. How did he feel before they happened? Did he smell anything strange before he lost consciousness? Did his head hurt afterward? Did his head hurt before? Did his head hurt now? But he did not ask the most important question of all, in David's view, because Dr. Mobley chose to believe that the attacks caused David to black out entirely, and that the boy could remember nothing of them before he regained consciousness. That wasn't true. David thought about telling Dr. Mobley of the strange landscapes that he saw when the attacks came, but Dr. Mobley had already begun asking about his mother again, and David didn't want to talk about his mother, not anymore, and certainly not with a stranger. Dr. Mobley asked about Rose, too, and how David felt about her. David didn't know how to answer. He didn't like Rose, and he didn't like his father being with her, but he didn't want to tell Dr. Mobley that in case he told David's father about it. By the end of the session, David was crying, and he didn't even know why. In fact, he was crying so hard that his nose began to bleed, and the sight of blood frightened him. He started to scream and shout. He fell on the floor, and a white light flashed in his head as he began to tremble. He beat his fists on the carpet and heard the books tut-tutting their disapproval as Dr. Mobley called for help, and David's dad came rushing in, and then everything went dark for what seemed like only seconds, but was in fact a very long time indeed. And David heard a woman's voice in the darkness, and he thought it sounded like his mother. A figure approached, but it was not a woman. It was a man, a crooked man with a long face, emerging